let's look at some of these dysfunctional God images that we've come up with. First, a separate God of otherness. Since an Epoch 2 ego has been expelled from the mother's paradise, or of undivided oneness, it reasons that God must live far away in heaven. We may hear people say God lives in us, and we may try to believe it. But to an immature Epoch ego that believes it knows everything about us, this is a very difficult idea to swallow. When you went to church, did you ever hear that? Oh, you know, God lives within you. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I never did when I was a child. God was always up there for me. I think the Epoch 2 ego reasons, well, if God lived within me, wouldn't I know it? You know, wouldn't I feel God's supernatural power and oneness? No, we wouldn't. Not as long as the ego remains fearful and separated from the inner world of the unconscious. So we seek God in outer symbols and beliefs and religious authorities, and we ignore our inner realities. Thus, for most Westerners, most of the time, the sacred is no longer an everyday reality, but a separate entity who must be approached through mental abstractions and experienced only in rare supernatural revelations and interventions. This God image is dysfunctional because it keeps our focus on societal norms and expectations. It prevents us from noticing or consulting our inner life. It blinds us to the sacredness of all life. And it robs us of the opportunity to experience sacred energies, except for very rare moments of grace. Another dysfunctional God image is a masculine God. Can you read this? This guy is saying, I'm the king of my castle and my word is gospel, do what I say or else. Well, maybe you've known people like that. Since Epoch 2 ego consciousness began, the Western and Middle Eastern God has been a male, as we all know. Why do I say this God is dysfunctional? Because in elevating masculinity and male values to the highest position of authority, we become imbalanced. We repress femininity, we relinquish our own authority, we diminish our own worth, we disown our entitlement to equal rights, and we abdicate our responsibility to grow psychologically and spiritually. A third dysfunctional God image arises out of a young ego's view of what it needs to survive and thrive in life. Like all children, I got my earliest ideas about God from my parents and grandparents. So I see now that this kind of God image represented Santa Claus. Santa sees us when we're sleeping, he knows when we're awake, all that, gives goodies to the good, doesn't give goodies to the bad. Did any of you ever believe in a God like that? Yeah, I think a lot of us do. I mean, that's a child's God image. The next one, a tribal God. This man is saying family's everything. Well, that's the way my husband's Italian family feels, and of course, it's fabulous. You must have correct beliefs, is what organized religions say. If you're not powerful and successful, you're nobody, which is what business-oriented people say. It's all about winning. You got to be the best, which is what athletes would say. These are things that they say because of the tribes they're in. When you're a teenager, your tribe says certain things. When you live in one part of the world or with a family that values art, then art is the most important thing to you. Historically, there was a very good reason for that, because strict adherence to the rules of a tribal God image was extremely effective in enhancing a tribe's chances for survival. A tribal God image becomes dysfunctional when it values the group's preservation more than those of anybody else. It enforces unjust rules, violates human rights, forces people into roles they wouldn't choose for themselves, restricts freedom of expression and belief, punishes those who are different, stifles creativity, and lacks compassion for those outside the tribe. So again, that's too narrow. A tribal God image only cares about me and my group. The next one is a God like us. Some of these overlap a little bit, but they have a slightly different emphasis, and that's the point I want to make. At some level, it becomes a national thing, not a tribal thing anymore. We begin to think, not only do I have a tribe, but my country is my tribe, and of course it is. So we're the good guys, Mom and apple pie and the Statue of Liberty and our particular kind of worship. So they're the bad guys. And what's dysfunctional about that? It makes it okay for us to suspect and fear and reject and even destroy people who are different. Another one, a gender-biased God. And again, the little marks mean, when I grew up in the, I was born, I won't tell you when I was born. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and in those days, a woman couldn't be an architect. I mean, it was very rare. You didn't ever see any women in architectural school, or 1 in a million. Doctors, women couldn't be doctors. I decided I had to be a nurse like my mother. I couldn't be a doctor. I couldn't belong to professional golf organizations, of course, because that was all for men. And I couldn't be a CEO of a company. Of course, that word didn't exist in those days. But I'm just saying, some of us maybe even still have some of those ideas, or certainly most of us, or many of us, especially as women and men, were raised with that kind of belief that, that God is biased against women and human males are more important than women. I'm emphasizing this bias against females because it's at the root of much of the polarization in our world today. But a bias against males and masculine quality is equally one-sided and dysfunctional. The problem is, if we have a strong prejudice against anyone or anything, that's a denial of our own potential. Here's another one. A conventionally moral God. So, think about the founders of our religions, the patriarchal religions. They were men who had evolved beyond Epoch 1. They were ahead of themselves and of their era and of their peers. They were people who had stronger egos. They were developing consciences. They were beginning to think about otherness and to realize that maybe there was some value in other people. And but they had dualistic thinking still. The ego just thinks dualistically, like those 2 hemispheres of the brain. So they chose what they considered to be good in every pair of opposites and formed their God images around these good qualities. But the problem is when we assign evil to the rejected opposite. That's what makes this God image dysfunctional, a conventionally moral God. So since I've mentioned the problems associated with the repressed feminine, I want to devote my final remarks to the need to evolve beyond our current level of moral reasoning, because that, of course, is very tied up in how we see God. We think of God as morally good. But what's good and what's bad depends on our level of moral reasoning. At this level, our reasoning about good and bad is this. Bad is whatever gets me punished and prevents me from getting what I want. That's the way a baby thinks, a child thinks. If I don't get what I want, I get to scream and throw tantrums, right? Because that's bad. It shouldn't be that way. Good, though, is whatever keeps us from being punished and gets us what we want. So it's a very self-interested, self-centered concept of morality. Level 2. This develops during the Epoch 2 of ego consciousness. Okay, now we're not babies anymore. We're not children. We have an ego. We're beginning to develop a conscience, and we're beginning to realize that I don't get to have everything my way. Mom and Dad are beginning to civilize me, so I'm beginning to grow up and think about other people a little bit. And so the emphasis now is on being a good boy or a good girl, according to my family's definition, and it's also about being good according to my social group's or society's definition. That's when our emphasis is on law and order. For the approximately 20% of people who move on to Epoch 3 consciousness and level 3 moral reasoning, this is when we realize that that's bad, that to not treat other people with fairness and justice is wrong. And a lot of people don't notice that at the level 2, moral reasoning. And we realize that everybody deserves fair treatment. And bad is anything that violates human rights. And good is whatever affirms human rights. Now think about people you know who fall in that category of advanced moral reasoning. Abraham Lincoln, assumably, one would assume, Martin Luther King. People for whom human rights is more important than the laws of my group, and I'm willing to risk breaking those laws if it means that people aren't treated fairly. That's a higher ethic. Can you see that than the normal moral, conventional way that we think. There aren't that many people, 20% about, who think that way now. We begin to connect the opposites that I talked to you about in the beginning. We begin to bump against otherness. We begin to make a sliver of understanding, to acquire some understanding. We begin to make allowances for their way of thinking. We begin to see that their way of thinking may be valid. We begin to see that our own shadows have a voice and a reality, and we need to pay attention to them. That's how we do it, by getting clear on the fact that we have got to take our inner lives seriously, and we've got to start looking at ourselves first. We begin to reconnect with the feminine sides of ourselves, the feeling sides, the soulful sides, the physical messages that our bodies and our intuitions give us, the tenderness, the softness, the gentleness, the mercifulness towards other forms of life, the beauty we begin to see in nature. We begin to hear the messages in nature. We begin to be part of something much bigger than just our own little inner ego worlds. Now we're connecting with otherness everywhere, and we're appreciating it, and we're learning to be honest about what we feel, and we're allowing ourselves to feel our emotions, and we're taking our feelings seriously because we're reconnecting with our feminine sides. And when that happens, and we retain the best of the masculine, we come to terms with our shadow, and we let the feminine back in our lives. Our God image becomes one of unified oneness, and we develop an ethic of integrity, humility, compassion, and love. I'd like to show you a few symbols in closing that express Epoch 3 and its God image of sacred oneness. This first one, does it look familiar? This art is contemporary art by a dear friend of mine named Cicero Greathouse, an Orlando artist. And when I asked him if he had any advice for the cover of my book, he said, well, I have some mandorla images you might want to check out on my website. And I did, and my publisher was, yeah, that's the one. So you can see how this, in a way, is a mandorla. It's made up of mandorla. It's almost like spirit and soul, heaven and earth. But it's also the opposites uniting at those levels. And then, here's the corpus callosum right smack in the middle, I love that. As we develop mature consciousness, the ripple effect takes over. And without even trying, we become agents for healing in everything we do. This is how we ease the imbalances in the world, by healing them in ourselves. This is how we become mature spirit persons, by opening to all of ourselves and all of God. Psychological integration births spiritual integration. Together, they create the sacred marriage. The offspring of this marriage are 9 gifts of spiritual wisdom: holistic perception, transforming light, acceptance of the shadow, emotional integrity, partnership, balance, sovereignty, meaning, and mandorla consciousness. Like human children, these gifts do not arrive fully mature, but they take time to develop. Thus, while our bodies will inevitably decline, our souls can celebrate the sacred marriage throughout the remainder of our lives, and I believe well beyond. Are we ready to begin the work for which we were born? Thank you.